Diving into the darkness, frightening tales of young Filipino boys engaged in underwater mining from Human Rights Watch's Juliane Kippenberg. With the anniversary of the Workers' Party taking place in Pyongyang this weekend, does anyone care? Plus more from the region, all coming up next. Hello everyone, I'm Joel Miller in for Steve this week. It's a pleasure to have you here on this Friday, October 9, 2015. We'll begin this week's podcast with a story Steve filed about gold miners in the Philippines.
Over the past couple of years, we have spoken about the issue regarding human rights in Asia several times. We've mentioned the trafficking of women, men being duped into performing hard labor, and of course, the deplorable practice by some to target mentally challenged individuals in South Korea and force them to work in slave-like conditions in salt mines. But for me, when it comes to children, that's what especially tugs on my heartstrings. Recently, there was a report released by Human Rights Watch that detailed the operation of compression mines in the Philippines. Miners, sometimes as young as 8 or 9 years old, breathe through flimsy plastic tubes. They're lured into confined, dark holes over 20 meters in depth in a search for gold. This week, I spoke with Juliane Kippenberg, Associate Director of Human Rights Watch's Children's Rights Division, and I started off our conversation by asking her how she became aware of this practice, as there are laws in place inside the Philippines supposedly preventing this type of activity.
Well, we've heard about this in part because this has been in the media and also because we have a researcher based there. And so we heard about this from local NGOs and other people on the ground. And we were particularly horrified about the practice of underwater mining, which is also often called compressor mining in the Philippines, where adolescents as well as adults dive into these very narrow shafts deep down into the water for hours on end, biting on a sort of a little plastic tube that provides them with oxygen.
Yeah, and are we talking about really an isolated area within the Philippines, or is it fairly widespread?
Child labor in small-scale gold mining is really widespread in the Philippines. There are small-scale gold mining areas really all across the country. And so we have found that this is a pretty common problem. In fact, small-scale gold mining is quite a significant sort of economic factor in the Philippines. It contributes to about 70% or so of the overall gold production, which was 18 tons in 2014. So therefore, child labor is definitely quite common in different parts of the country, not just in 1 or 2 provinces. But we did only visit 2 provinces, and to our knowledge, the practice of underwater mining is far more limited. It definitely exists in Camarines Norte province, but we don't know if it also exists a lot in other places. We did observe it a little bit in Masbate province, but we didn't find any children working there.
Okay, well, let's talk about your trip there, because you were actually there on the ground. Can you describe what you saw taking place?
First of all, when we went, I'll start with telling you a little bit about the underwater mining, because you were just asking me about that. But then I'll tell you a little bit also about the other types of really dangerous work, which is, for example, the work in deep pits and the work with mercury. But to start with the underwater mining, so basically this underwater mining takes place in coastal areas. Obviously, the gold ore is underneath the water table. So people have figured out that one way of getting to the ore is to dive for it, for example, in rivers and also right on the shore of the coast. And we observed this in several places. So in one city, for example, Jose Panganiban, we saw how there was this sort of makeshift structure on a bay where then dozens of people or so were actually diving. We saw this from a distance, and colleagues of mine went to that place and interviewed people there. And then myself, I went to another place which was on a river, and it was accessible, but it wasn't that easily accessible. So it was a little bit hidden, and there was, I think, a sense of some of the miners that this was not strictly allowed. we did manage, nevertheless, to get there. We hired a very narrow, wobbly canoe or boat that took us out there. I actually, on a sort of anecdotal basis, I just left behind all my things except my notebook and my camera because I really felt everything could just tip onto the water.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, the canoe was completely wet and it was also raining, and it was just like, it was one of these canoes where you just come out and you're basically soaked, but that's okay. So anyway, we went to that mining, we went out down that river a little bit, and the further we went down, the louder it became because there was these machines sort of making this loud noise in the distance, and it was these compressors that provide the oxygen to those who are diving. So then we found this site and, went ashore there and talked to people, and basically ended up talking to some adult miners, also sort of the mine manager, but also to some of the boys who were working there. And one of them just that day had actually started to dive for the first time, or had tried, and he failed. He said it was so hard and so scary and was so cold and dark down there that he couldn't do it. But we interviewed other boys. I interviewed one other boy there who'd been doing it for 3 years. He was 17 then. He'd been 14 when he started, and he was doing this, really routinely. And that boy and other boys told us how that worked for them, and how when they went down the first time, they had experienced so much fear, they were so frightened, but now they were usually more or less used to it. But they also spoke of a lot of issues. So, for example, another kid told us how sometimes this tube actually stops working, and then they suddenly have to come up from quite deep down to be able to breathe.
Did you get the impression that authorities were essentially turning a blind eye to allowing this to happen? I mean, we're talking about child labor here in some really hazardous conditions. I mean, there's supposed to be laws on the books to prevent this kind of exploitation. Why is it being allowed to continue?
So basically, the reason why this is not actually being properly enforced is, from our perspective, it's sort of a mix of lack of political will, lack of capacity, and a disconnect between the national government, the center, and the local level. So on the books, as you say, the laws are quite strong. There's really good laws prohibiting the use of hazardous child labor. There are good action plans in place on child labor, and actually some other really good programs as well that to some extent may already reach children. But it's not enough. And clearly the government hasn't done enough to really make a change and really tackle this problem. One of the reasons is surely that, there's always this tendency in the Philippines to burden the local administration, the barangays, with action and require them to act, but they're not, and they don't necessarily have the funds or the capacity to do so. And in addition, it's not very popular for them to do so. It's not necessarily going to go down very well with the business community if the local barangay decides to regulate mining, possibly even close some of the mine sites, and so on. So it would really potentially be cause of friction and conflict. Some of the local officials are even themselves involved in mining operations or have a stake in them. So then, of course, you really have a conflict of interest. So those are some of the reasons why we think it's not enough is being done. In general, the government has basically allowed this small-scale gold mining sector to develop and expand and pollute and cause various social problems, including child labor, without much regulation. There is a new effort now by the government to formalize the sector and put the emphasis on the need to really have legal, regularized, and monitored operations. But so far, that's practically not the case. There are only about 4 sort of licensed small-scale gold mining operations or small-scale mining operations in the Philippines right now. So practically all of the ones that are in existence presently are illegal.
There is a great deal more to our conversation, and you'll be able to catch it in its entirety Saturday in the Asia Now podcast feed over on the website. But for now, I'd like to hear from you. If you have any thoughts, opinions, or something else to add, please drop me a line.
This weekend marks the 70th anniversary of the Workers' Party in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, also called North Korea, and sometimes more affectionately known as the red-headed stepchild of East Asia. Over the weekend, there will be a big celebration in Pyongyang, and to that we ask the question, does anyone really care? The answer, a resounding no. North Korea is a problem child that the world has tired of. Taking a look at the recent UN General Assembly meeting, North Korea was hardly mentioned by members because, well, let's face it, there are significantly more pressing issues on the world stage than the stout Mr. Kim. So what does that mean for the weekend and a possible missile launch or nuclear test? In the past, whenever North Korea has faded from the headlines, the Kim regime has done something to try and turn the spotlight back on Pyongyang. I suspect this weekend will be no different. But let's be honest about things. The parade and celebration is most likely going to be a meh event. It's going to be directly compared to Beijing's celebration, and China will win that competition hands down. So that leads us to the more provocative acts of missile launches and nuke tests. On the missile front, there are no signs at the Sohae launch facility. If there's going to be a satellite or ICBM launch, this is the place where they've carried them out in the past. And while there's some activity, nothing is on the gantry yet. One simply can't fire what isn't there. In fact, think tank 38 North has even gone as far as to say a launch is impossible. On the nuclear side of things, the news is pretty much the same, which has led 38 North to call a nuclear test this weekend impossible as well. So what could happen? That's honestly a guessing game. But here are some possibilities since Kim doing nothing puts him at risk for becoming more of a joke than he already is, firing off short-range missiles like he's done in the past. These are old Soviet-era missiles and made for a great show. Would probably get some condemnation, but in the long run are a non-event. Kim could elect to fire a medium-range missile, something like the KN-08. These are mobile weapons and would make quite the stink on the peninsula. Really making things interesting with the weekend's events, China is sending a delegation to the festivities. Liu Yunshan, who ranks 5th in China's ruling Communist Party hierarchy, is heading the delegation. The question will be is if the olive branch will be enough to curb any erratic behavior from Kim. Some analysts are reading into the move that Beijing is trying to make some overtures to boost ties. However, Song Xingji, an expert in Korean Peninsula affairs at Jilin University in China, told the South China Morning Post that Liu's visit just shows they are maintaining a party-to-party relationship, which is the bottom line for the two sides to maintain communication. The visit will not improve the relationship, but they cannot afford to completely ignore each other. And that's true. China is really no fan of the DPRK, but it needs it to exist as a buffer between it and Western interests. So Beijing doesn't want it to go away. It actually really can't afford for it to go away. So the thing to watch this weekend isn't necessarily what Kim Jong-un does, but what happens and how China responds. Beijing can probably deal with a minor launch, but something stronger than that, a nuclear test or satellite launch, might signal the end of supportive ties. Regardless of China, the world still needs to come together to deal with the petulant child that is Kim Jong-un. This week, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, was given the go-ahead by the 12 member states. Proponents of the U.S.-led agreement say the deal would liberalize trade for 40% of the world economy and is needed to compete with rival China's growing economic power. But some already think that the TPP would even be stronger with China joining the fold. The specifics of the plan have yet to be released, but it's estimated that some 18,000 American tariffs will find their way that of the dodo. The deal could be a mixed blessing for many. For example, in Japan, the agricultural sector may face tougher competition from cheaper imports, while its auto industry may reap the benefits of cheaper parts. Another possible result of the TPP may be higher costs of imported drugs. This because pharmaceutical companies would have an 8-year monopoly on distribution before generics would be made available. Just who will be the big winners and losers of the deal may take decades to uncover. File this under the predictability desk. Following the deadly letter bomb attacks last week in Guangxi province, China has imposed censorship controls on domestic media. A notice from the Central Propaganda Department restricted all Chinese media, including social media, from sending reporters to Luzhou or publishing special coverage, while another notice by the Cyberspace Administration bans the use of close-up shots of the blast scenes. Republish only authoritative sources such as Xinhua News. Violators must immediately redress this and delete their posts, read the instructions cited by China Digital Times, an independent news agency that reports on censorship policies. Keyword searches, even on social media sites like Weibo, have since been censored despite the police determining the blasts to be criminal in nature. Critics say that it's common practice for Chinese authorities to mitigate the spread of bad news or the possibility of rumor-mongering, most likely in this case since the blasts took place just ahead of National Day. But come on, this is the 21st century, and even with a great firewall, people can find out what happened. So censoring it does nothing. Hong Kong-based columnist Willie Lam said, "It's one more example of disgruntled citizens using private and very violent means to vent their frustration because they have no recourse to justice vis-a-vis serious problems with the Chinese courts, which are heavily politicized." He added that Chinese people have lost faith in its judicial system, which is especially the case in rural areas such as Luzhou, where courts are likely under the Communist Party's control, meaning that the censorship is more about curtailing the failure of the rule of law than the deadly blast itself. As previously mentioned in an earlier Asia Beef podcast on Thailand contemplating instituting a China-like nationwide firewall, and how hacktivists took to the internet and forced several governments' websites offline, the Thai government looks to be retreating, at least in part, from that embarrassing incident. Members from the Thai government said this past week the plan was merely in the feasibility study stage and the pros and cons of the proposal were being weighed. They said the plan would no longer be called a single gateway, but also didn't give any other information of what would be actually implemented. Information and Communication Technology Minister Uttama said that government would not infringe upon the public's right to privacy and freedom of expression as it was only reviewing the country's internet gateways. Then it promptly blocked the website the anti-single gateway people used to muster the troops. The minister urged the public to try to understand the plan to implement the single gateway system more thoroughly, saying that it was intended to make Thailand more competitive in the online economy in line with the Digital Economy Bill. He added that the proposal is not yet definite. The government does not have a plan to implement these things, but just to study it to look after the youth. Don't worry that internet freedom will be taken away, said Uttama. Yeah, right. Since taking control, the junta has excelled at infringing on the public's right to privacy and freedom of expression. Remember those attitude adjustments the Prime Minister uses on those that speak critically of him? Now we're poised for a possible confrontation. A group calling itself Citizens Against Single Gateway has issued an ultimatum, demanding that the plan be scrapped before midnight on October 14 or the government would face an unprecedented level of cyber attacks. The groups asked for understanding from the general public should it have to move forward. It anticipates that should it act on its threat, what it calls a time of war, collateral damage and losses would be unavoidable. The sad thing is that while the government and hacktivists took things out, the average Thai citizen simply trying to use the net will be the most affected because of the resulting disruption of service and online censorship. Perhaps one of the biggest regional news stories of late has been the ongoing effects of the haze generated by slash-and-burn operations in Kalimantan and Sumatra, Indonesia. Indonesia this week said it will need 3 years to contain and douse the forest fires causing the haze. So if you're not in the region and wondering why other nations are voicing such strong opinions for Indonesia to do more, now you know why. Since living under sometimes hazardous levels of smoke is a bit too much to ask. Malaysia has also asked Jakarta to compensate the country for the losses incurred from the transboundary smoke. In Penang, hawker business, those selling Penang's famous street food, has dropped some 30%. Then, of course, there's the associated medical costs incurred for treating those affected. It's a misguided plea as Indonesia is doing everything it can to tackle the situation. What needs to be in place is a deal with Jakarta to go after the companies like Singapore does. Going after Indonesia, who is tasked with cleaning up the mess, isn't the way to go. Indonesia says it understands the region's frustrations, but assures they're doing all they can and that those living in Indonesia are even more frustrated with the situation. Surprisingly, Thailand's Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha has put forward the idea of tackling the haze on an ASEAN-level basis, which makes sense. With so many nations being affected, rather than griping about what Jakarta is or isn't doing to resolve the situation, get everyone involved to put the fires out and bring to justice those who set the forests ablaze. And that is exactly what appears to be happening. Thursday, Indonesian President Joko Widodo requested help from Singapore, Russia, Malaysia, and Japan to fight the forest fires. If the ASEAN members can pledge enough resources, then it wouldn't take 3 years to snuff the fires. It may also set the stage for a more unified stance against China in sea disputes. Coming together now is what's needed to expedite haze removal, as the problem is too big for one country to handle alone. That's it for the news, but before I go, here are a few comments from the week. First up, the noob said this about Hong Kong. China could be so much stronger economically if they let Hong Kong have their democracy, but let themselves handle certain things, like the top-level stuff. It could even be that the democratic leader would be a voice for Hong Kong with the higher-ups. It's not like the President of the United States has all the power. Jim McBride on North Korea said this, Kim Jong-un makes me laugh every time I see him. I was in South Korea in the early 80s and the Chinese smuggler haircut was only worn by petty criminals and those on the fringe of society, punks and thugs, because that is who originated this hairstyle that Jong-un wears now. The Chinese smugglers who crossed the border with contraband years ago, and nobody with a good reputation would copy that look, unless they lost a heavy bet. Leonard King had this to say about China's capabilities in Asia. If China attacks U.S. bases, the bases will be wiped out before the U.S. can respond. They will be overwhelmed. Quertian left this message on our Malaysian Human Rights Discussion podcast. Being a Malaysian, these issues are very personal to me and I appreciate the attention being brought to a bigger audience. Thanks, and I hope we will get to hear more news from Human Rights Watch. Lucas Musser on our story about a man in India killed for allegedly eating beef. I agree with you on the last remark about religion. If you're a person of faith, then good for you. But if you do things like lynching, you're a sheep and probably not a very good person of faith either. We'd like to extend our thanks to everyone who took the time to send in a comment this week. We truly appreciate it. If you have a thought or opinion about one of the stories in this episode, we'd love to hear from you. So please write in or record yourself and mail in an audio file.
Hey, my friends, if you enjoyed this week's podcast, I hope you'll do me a favor and share it with your friends. And if you haven't, subscribe. Subscribing is free and easy to do. Just go to our website, asiannewsweekly.net, and click on the subscribe tab. You can also subscribe in your favorite podcast application like iTunes or Stitcher. Now, if you want to keep up with more news from the region, be sure to follow Asian News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. And of course, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, I'd love to hear from you. The email address to write to is podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. My name is Steve Miller, and I'd like to thank you so much for listening this week. So until next time, be true to yourself and always be awesome.